the question I always ask if somebody's gone through a bankruptcy or their company didn't make it for whatever reason is a simple question. It's like, well, what did you learn from that? You really can see things like, oh gosh, in hindsight being 2020, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish we'd done this. The successes, sometimes you can have the opposite. You can create this sort of almost fictional narrative. And you see this around the most hyper successful companies where books get written and there's sort of this almost revisionist history about how easy it was or how.
Welcome everybody to season 2 of the Tech Leaders Playbook. We're really excited, thrilled to have Mike Trigg on the show today. Mike is a Silicon Valley executive with a very rich background in marketing, sales, customer service, AI, and most importantly, recently he's become would you call it an author, right?
An author, yes.
Yeah. So he's got an MBA from UC Berkeley, and he's got a wealth of experience in revenue generating functions and how to build companies. So I'm thrilled to have you here, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Avetis.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mike, let's start with your journey. I know for a fact you didn't wake up one day in your 20s and started writing novels about Bay Area craziness. Tell us how you got to this point.
Well, I considered that, to be honest. After undergrad was kind of when I first had the writing bug. I was, I took a creative writing class in undergrad and really enjoyed it. And I think I kind of chickened out back then. I sort of thought, gosh, that's a hard path. It's hard to make a living, let alone, a proper income doing it. And so I pursued kind of what I described at the time as writing adjacent stuff. I got into public relations and communications. I worked on Capitol Hill as a press secretary for a senator. So that was kind of career V1. And then while I was doing that, I heard about this thing called the Information Superhighway. This was back in the early 90s, before we called it.
I know it is based on what you called it.
Right. And so, that really intrigued me. I pivoted into the private sector, worked for big telecom companies and networking hardware companies. Moved to California, went to UC Berkeley for business school to, get myself out in the Bay Area. And jumped into the world of tech. By then it was the dot-com boom, and I had the bug for sure. I really enjoyed it. I worked for a wide variety of companies over 20 plus years, in almost every capacity you can imagine, employee, co-founder, founder, executive, investor, et cetera. In other words, a pretty typical Silicon Valley career. People jump around and do a lot of companies and have wear a lot of hats. And then, but there was always this writing bug in me too. I had, as I mentioned, always been interested in doing it, and the way my first novel came about was really just sort of stories about my day. I'd get home and share with my wife, something funny or crazy that happened just in the course of doing business. And she sort of said, hey, these are funny stories or interesting stories. And I felt like there's an incredible amount of media attention and nonfiction books about Silicon Valley, but there are very, very few novels about Silicon Valley. And so the marketer in me, the MBA in me, felt like that was a gap in the marketplace. I thought I could write a compelling novel about that. So that was my first book. It was called Bitflip. It came out in August of 22. After I made the decision to pivot full-time to writing. And so that was great. That book is kind of a corporate thriller about a guy who's an executive at a tech startup who discovers possible fraud within the company. And it's a question of, what's he going to do about that? And so it's a thriller, but it's also, a cultural critique of, Silicon Valley and tech culture and those sorts of things as well. And although it's totally fiction, the story really encapsulates a lot of the learnings that I had over the course of my career. So that was a lot of fun to write. And then, from there, I really did get the bug. My second novel, which is called Burner, which delves a little bit more into my political background, comes out. That's kind of a political psychological thriller that comes out in April. So I'm very excited about that. And I've got my third book, written and going into editing on that. So I guess long-winded answer, I'm a novelist now.
I love it. Mike, what's cool about that is, I love reading books. I read almost a book a week if I can do it. Sometimes I read multiple books at the same time.
Yeah.
But they're mostly just business books, right?
Yeah.
And they're awesome, but sometimes you just get tired and want to just relax. But
Yeah.
my mind is very focused on the business world. So if I can read a fiction, some kind of novel, but that keeps me in the business world, I think I would enjoy it more. So I'm going to check that out. Is that available on Libby and the Amazon apps?
Yeah, it's available pretty much everywhere. The you can buy it on Amazon, of course. I always encourage folks to buy through their local bookstores, or through other platforms, bookshop.org, that give back to local bookstores. There's also it's available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. So as will the second book, Burner, when it comes out.
Nice. I'm gonna check that out for sure. Mike, you've worn so many different hats throughout your career, right? And you've worked at tiny startups to multinational companies. You've been a founder 3 times, C-level executive, investor, sales, biz dev. You've truly done it all. I guess what is the one hat that you wore that had the most significant impact and shaped your career the most?
That's a tough question. I mean, I think the thing that I enjoy the most is very, very early stage. That's kind of the same thing I enjoy about writing novels, is creating something out of nothing just kind of gives me a rush, having a kernel of an idea and fleshing that out and seeing that idea manifest itself, is my passion. It's what I really enjoy. But that all said, I'm kind of an extrovert. I really probably some of the roles that I've enjoyed and I'm most nostalgic about when I look back on my career in tech were managing big teams. I really enjoyed that part of the job, and that's obviously not really what you're doing when you're writing. It's you have a team, you have a creative team for sure, editors, designers, proofreaders, etc. But it's a little bit different managing a team, growing a team, and so that part I do miss. I think that was always something that I really enjoyed. Sort of played to my strengths. That's an equally thrilling ride, right? When you build out and hire out a team, and there are people who and you trust, and you've been in the trenches with. That's just a real kick too. I mean, there are folks that were among the very first people I worked with in Silicon Valley 20 plus years ago, who are still close friends of mine from those experiences. So it's hard to isolate one thing. There's a lot of factors that I enjoy about the career. And even though I'm not in the tech industry directly anymore, I stay involved. I'm an advisor with some companies. I have small investments in a handful of companies. So those are fun ways to sort of give back or stay, keep a foot in the water, if you will.
You worked at so many successful companies. I think one of the first startups the first startup you joined was acquired for $3 billion, correct? At the peak of the bubble?
Yeah, that was kind of crazy times. But yeah, I was at a software company that was doing, kind of a precursor to Salesforce, web-based CRM software. And we got acquired by a company that was a public company at the time for, a generous amount of money. And I was just an early employee at that company. I wasn't a co-founder or anything, but
yep.
If I didn't have the bug before, I certainly had it after that, right? I mean, nothing makes you feel like energized and excited about a space like having a big exit like that. What I learned in my career after that is that's damn hard to do when it's not a gigantic internet bubble. And I've had the longevity in Silicon Valley to have lived through, the 2008 downturn, the 2020, obviously everything that happened with COVID, both positive and negative to the tech sector. So I've definitely seen those business cycles come and go.
And now too. I mean, right now no one talks about it, but we're in a recession in tech at least, and have been for 18 months, I feel like. No one talks about that.
Yeah, it's almost a really hard environment to describe right now because it's simultaneously a bubble and a famine, and in certain sectors, that's why every company's slapping the term AI onto what they do. That sector has, incredible hype, incredible momentum, tons of capital flooding into it. I think it is a bubble. I think there's going to be a lot of companies that don't really deliver the goods in that regard, and the market will sort of eventually discover that and it'll shake out. But there are a ton of good tech companies, and even among public companies, it's a weird dynamic. You really look at what's driving S&P 500 kind of growth. It's 5 companies essentially. I mean, it's so it's one of these interesting things that is counterintuitive to the internet overall, is that with unlimited choice, we seem to always concentrate our energy, attention, money into, a smaller and smaller percentage of self-declared winners. And I don't think that that's great for the ecosystem. I think, concentrating value in, Alphabet, Meta, Tesla, NVIDIA, Apple, that's not great. That's not great for the ecosystem unless those companies really are doing what they kind of do, which is invest and incubate and spread that wealth and acquire companies and become mechanisms for growth. But a lot of what we've seen in the last few years is just sort of a concentration, a lifting of competitive moats around those businesses to really reap, disproportionate rewards.
Agreed. Now, in other companies, I think Hightail and Tello, Russell, you were playing a very a higher level roles. It sounds like. What are some key strategies that you found most effective in driving company growth and innovation?
Yeah, well, the companies you mentioned are all software companies, apps, and via websites. Obviously, the business of those that was at the greatest scale was Hightail. We went through a name change while I was there. A lot of people recognize it as under its original name, which was You Send It. So it was sort of a way to share large files. I have, to get to your question, I am a product person, even though I'm not an engineer by training. I love product, and by that I mean every aspect of product, right? Not just the code and the tech, but who's the buyer? What's the value proposition? What are the features? What's your distribution look like? Everything that is necessary to make a product scale and successful. And so I always start from there, and I kind of have this litmus test that I apply, when people approach me about potentially investing today too. If I can't describe that business idea in a nutshell to, whoever in your world who's not particularly tech literate, the grandmother litmus test is like, if she can't understand it, then it's probably too complicated, right? And there are a lot of businesses that you just sort of hear their pitch and you're like, I have no idea who's your buyer.
No idea what you do, sir.
Right. No, who's your buyer? Why do they care? What other products are they using to solve that today? So that for me is always where I start, and it's almost like a good novel. Like what are you looking for? It's like when you see it, right? You can just kind of feel it. You can articulate it. You can look at that business and say, yes, okay, I understand this. I understand why somebody wants it, why it's uniquely positioned in the marketplace, what competitive advantages are sustainable to that particular product, et cetera. And then you can lean into it, and really sort of the next thing you need to figure out is, what is the scale of that, right? So sometimes you can have that light bulb go off and you say, I get it. But you really delve into it and you realize it's a market of 10 people, right? And so you need, in a perfect world, something's easy to understand, clear value proposition, but also a large addressable market. And sometimes you don't know that second part of it until you get into it. The best, if something's obvious and huge market, there's usually millions of competitors in it too, right? So the things that have really taken off are ones where it has an intuitive value proposition, but you sort of didn't realize how big the market was until you got in there, and people are like, oh, I do need that after all. You think microwave ovens that's a great example, or smartphones. Like microwave oven, like it was kind of the thing. You're like, why do I need that? I'm old enough. I'm dating myself to know when microwave ovens first came out, but or VCRs, like pick tech as I was growing up. And then, of course, the smartphone was an example of that too. I mean, I remember kind of looking at the first iPhone and going, okay, so I can scroll through my contacts, like I can swipe. You know, it was a little bit of a cognitive disconnect. And then you realize, oh my gosh, this is the world in my pocket. Of course, this has utility as apps came onto the platform and everything else. And so those types of products that address a need that we don't even know that we had, those are the real lightning in a bottle products.
So, Mike, you and I are both angel investors. So, you know, I'm a board member of an angel fund. I invest in a lot of different angel networks. What do you look for when you're investing? And how do you assess kind of the long-term viability of these startups? I mean, you alluded to it in the last statement you made, but like, what do you typically look for? And when do you sense some red flags and say, hey, I'm good, I'll pass, or, ooh, they've got something?
Yeah, well, some of the roles that I had sort of in the last few years of my tech career were on the investment side. I was kind of an entrepreneur in residence at a couple of investment funds that focused on AI specifically, where I was sort of, I wasn't a partner at those funds, but I was sort of looking at those businesses from the perspective of the investor, right? How viable are these, et cetera? And I've been an advisor with several venture firms, and obviously been on the board and worked closely with venture capital investors throughout my whole career. And so I think the thing that a lot of founders underestimate or overlook is that scalability of the business, right? So, you know, it's just sort of the fundamental dynamics of venture capital as an investment class. They're going to put money into a variety of deals, and they're super early stage. And so by definition, they're very high risk. And, you know, as pretty much any VC will tell you, if they make 10 bets, you know, 7 or 8 probably go out of business entirely. 1 maybe returns cents on the dollar or even money. And hopefully you get 1 out of those 10 that, you know, returns the entire fund. It's a huge success. And so what a venture investor is looking for, therefore, is things that can have that real hyper-growth hockey stick, because otherwise it's kind of not interesting. There's actually a line in my first book that I heard from a real investor. We were working at a company that I'll remain unnamed, and we thought we were doing great as an executive team. You know, we'd cut costs, we'd gotten the business profitable, we were hitting our revenue targets, growing nicely. But, you know, it was clear that we weren't going to be a multi-billion-dollar business, right? You know, and when you're just sort of growing gradually, you know, you should be getting your investment from banks or, you know, other sources, not from venture capital. And so, you know, I remember one of our board members sort of saying, hey, you know, I love what you're doing. You guys have done an incredible job, but you know, it's not going to do what I need it to do, right? It's not going to be the company that returns our fund. And it was kind of like, oh man, I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective. So again, I think a lot of entrepreneurs, you know, aren't maybe honest with themselves about that hockey stick potential in their business. And if that's the case, then there are other approaches, right? You don't have to take venture capital. There are other ways to fund your business. You can, of course, bootstrap it. You can raise angel money. You can, you know, in some cases, get bank loans. You know, every business has a little bit different investment profile, and venture investment gets the lion's share of attention because it's a lot of capital, and sort of the stories we all love to tell each other in Silicon Valley tend to be those kinds of companies. But if your business, you could have a business that's slower growth, you know, profitable. You know, pejoratively, investors will call that a lifestyle business, meaning it doesn't have that hockey stick potential, but you could have a wonderfully lucrative startup as the entrepreneur's perspective, because you haven't given away too much of the equity. You've grown it responsibly.
It's sustainable.
It's sustainable, and you own a much bigger percentage of it when it exits. So sometimes I've posed it to entrepreneurs and I've said, hey, you know, in 5 years or 10 years, oftentimes, do you think this is a company that sells for, you know, $50 million and you own 50% of it? Or do you think it's a company that sells for $1 billion and you own 5% of it or less, right? And those, you know, usually that's kind of a way to sort of sort that out and say, oh, you know, gosh, it is hard for me to imagine it really getting to that $1 billion exit. or not. So I've worked and partnered and been an advisor with a lot of startups who, are kind of like, gosh, we're getting rejection after rejection. And that usually is the root answer, right? The VC will look at it. They're like, we like the founders, we like the business, we think it's an interesting product, we get the marketplace, but we just don't think it has that hockey stick potential for us to justify an investment. Or oftentimes too, you'll see this happen. They kind of hang around the hoop, right? There's like, well, maybe, right? But I don't know if I believe it yet. I want to see more demonstrable traction. And so you'll get that dynamic as well, where VCs will be like, we love what you're doing, but it's a little early for us, right? That's kind of code for, we haven't quite seen that inflection start to happen. And if and when it does, then, we're going to be there. And frankly, at that point, you have the opposite problem. You have a lot of venture investors who are ready to jump in. So you kind of have to find somebody who believes in that potential just before you show that potential. Because once you show that potential, of course, everybody wants to invest.
Mike, it sounds like just like a human being, you want to know yourself. As a company, as a company leadership team, founding group should know who they are.
Yeah.
So if you realize, hey, maybe we are not a $1 billion business, let's just go for 100 million, but let's bootstrap it initially. Let's get small, investments here and there. Maybe we don't need investments. Maybe we don't need to go the VC route. Maybe we exit to a private equity firm and, for 70, 80 million and still win in a big way.
Yeah.
So understanding who you are and what you are is incredibly important, it sounds like, to a startup when deciding what route to take. Because there's two trains of thought. Don't listen to anybody, keep going.
Yeah.
Right? And then there's the other train of thought is, no, listen to people, learn. Right?
Yeah.
Learn, actually listen to what they're saying. Don't hit your head against the wall. Maybe they know something. That's a tough balance. How do you measure that, right? Because that's very tricky and sticky right there, because for every story that I can tell you, hey, so many VCs said no, and then I did this, and now they're begging me to invest. And it's a beautiful story. You hear 100 other companies that didn't listen to the early signs and went the wrong direction. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's so many ways I could take that question. I think one of the other mistakes that you see sort of post-investment maybe illustrates this point the best, which is, a lot of times companies will take venture investment and, then it's sort of a throw fuel on the fire kind of moment, right? Like another incentive that venture investors have is they need that hypergrowth. And so they'd almost rather have you swing for the fences to try and achieve that and burn through capital like a drunken sailor, rather than sort of slow grow it, right? And I've been on the other side of that, where there's been enormous pressure from the board and the VC investors to say, hey, you got to go fast. And we would invest in things that maybe weren't sustainable growth and were expensive. A lot of mistake a lot of companies make is they just sort of hire too fast. They hire ahead of their curve, and then and then you get into this challenge where you're overstaffed. You're like, we don't like our burn rate. We don't know if we can get to our next milestones for our next funding, and so we need to scale back. And that's always tough for the culture and of the company if you end up going through layoffs and stuff like that. So I think what you said is the nail on the head. You kind of need to be honest with yourself. And I think I have had moments of that candor with boards too, where it's sort of like, we could try these things, but that's going to be a risky strategy. And, it's a little bit unproven. Maybe we're at sort of a circle of the wagons moment where we want to get the product a little further, or get our customer acquisition working better, or oftentimes customer retention working better, because leaky buckets are where a lot of software companies die. And it can take a little bit to sort those things out. And so that is, I think, can be very helpful, is to have that open and candid conversation with your investors, especially if they are, from institutional funds that are really looking for that growth. Will they have the patience? And sometimes you don't know until you open up that conversation with them one-on-one, by the way, not board meetings usually is better, because each of your investors can have conflicting incentives, right? Some funds might be looking to return to their investors on a shorter time horizon. They might be earlier or later in their funds. They might have reserves that they've held aside to put into your company. And so all those things create dynamics that aren't always intuitive and obvious to the entrepreneur. They're good questions, by the way, to ask before you even take the money, but that can help you understand. And those incentives can be a little bit different. If you have 2-3 venture investors, they might have all slightly different dynamics. Maybe one's the founding partner, and so they can do whatever they want within their fund. Maybe one's a more junior partner, and so they've got to watch out for their own political reputation within their fund. And so those dynamics, I think I was sort of naive to when I was earlier in my career. And again, I wrote those into my book, BitFlip. As they're sort of going through the ups and downs of trying to sort out what they discover, this potentially fraudulent activity going on within the company. The protagonist, Sam, sort of steps on a bunch of things, landmines that he didn't even know were there, right? And I thought, that is something, that's perspective that you don't really get too often into what those internal dynamics can be on a venture-backed company.
What's a good time to pivot? Because I've seen companies that are startups that are too stubborn, right? And never pivot. They don't listen to the signs because, again, they heard the one amazing story where everybody laughed at them, gave them no money, and now they're a $1 billion company. There's 1,000 stories of, skeleton companies in the grave. What are or they pivot too quickly and they're constantly pivoting. And I'm like, I don't even know what your product is anymore. I invested in this and now it's this. And then, it's cool. I'll go with the flow, but I guess the question for you is, at what point should a company, the startup, look at itself and make the right pivot? When's the right time?
Yeah, that is the $50 billion question. It's very hard to answer that. I think, the glib answer I'd give is as soon as possible, right? If you really worry that you're not, you don't have product market fit is kind of the term of art, right? And if you feel like you do not have product market fit in your current space, it might be time to pivot, right? If you are sort of stubbornly pushing a rock uphill, you might need to get a reality check. I think the time when it's the opposite, the time to persevere and really, commit yourself to breaking through, is if you really do see that kernel of product market fit, right? If you have early customers who are like, I love this product, I can't imagine life without it, then I think you need to really think, should we have the courage of our conviction and push through and figure out, is it something else besides product market fit that's holding us back, right? Maybe people don't know about our product. Maybe our onboarding and trial process isn't good. Maybe maybe we have friction in our new customer onboarding, whatever it is. There can be good explanations for why you have product market fit, but you're not achieving sort of revenue traction and scale. So those are kind of the fundamentals that I look at to kind of answer that question. There aren't a lot of good examples of companies that pivoted successfully, though. It is really, really hard to do. I sort of touched on one in my past experience. We were originally Sendit, which was a way to send large files. That was all it is. When you try to send an attached audio file or video file and it would bounce because it was too big for the email server, we provided a way to upload that file and send it to whoever you were sending it to. Well, that whole business kind of disappeared, right? As Dropbox came online and file size limits on Gmail and other things went way, 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 way up. It was sort of like, all right, we had great product market fit early on, but we can see in the metrics that business is dying, right? It was harder to acquire customers, it's harder to retain customers. That business went through a pivot and renaming to Hightail, where we tried to be, we described it as sort of a creative collaboration solution, because a lot of our users, that was what they were doing. They were creative professionals that were trying to work with the client. And so we added, tasks and feedback and commenting and all these features we thought would work well there. We felt like we had very good product market fit, but that pivot was just really hard to execute, right? Our classic sort of legacy customers sort of didn't want us to do all that stuff. They wanted us to still just be a simple way to send files. But we, as the executive team, saw that business was a dying one. And so we ultimately ended up, selling that company. And I think it's a wonderful product, by the way, for creative professionals. A lot of people in the podcasting and audio space use it, but that can be hard to do. Probably the company that jumps to mind as most famously executing on a total pivot was Slack. They started out as like a gaming platform and developed this tool that they were using internally. And they were like, hey, this tool that we're using internally is a really good product. Maybe that should be what we do. And that became what we know of as Slack today. And so, they did it quite early, but they had to torpedo a legacy business, had to go back to their investors, say, we're pivoting. I've also lived through this on the investor side. So I was an investor in an early stage company that I thought was very interesting. I thought it had product market fit. And they sort of, I thought, executed a pivot maybe too early, right? Kind of gave up on what they were doing, went into something that, kind of was, to my mind, a little bit hard to articulate. Web 3.0, I'm not really sure what that is, sort of thing. And, unfortunately, the company was shut down, 6 months later. So it's a hard question to answer. And I think that's why they pay the CEO and the founder, the big bucks, theoretically.
The big bucks.
Yeah, is to make those tough decisions.
Mike, one of the things that I've noticed as more AI and more automation tools come about, founders of companies are spending less and less time with their customers.
Yes.
And you as a person that's played in roles of customer service throughout your career, you probably would agree with me, but I think, and this is true because most founders of companies are product people or engineering people, and they're not necessarily the type that want to do sales.
Yeah.
Right. And two, they don't love doing customer service. But the problem with that is your customers fall in love with you, not just your product, and the way you deal with them, the pivots you make for them. I see a major concern there. When I buy a product as a tech company myself, and I don't get the kind of customer service I want, they're gone. I mean, within a month, I will literally send an email and say, hey, whoever my executives that's dealing with is, hey, let's go ahead and send a termination. No, we just signed a contract. It's okay. When we're done with the 9 months, let's go ahead and cancel because I'm not getting the love I need, and that's not okay. So I guess my advice is, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is don't forget to take care of your customers. Don't go getting new customers. Absolutely. It's a lot more costly to get new customers versus retaining yours and building a bunch of what I call raving fans, right? Where they can't help but to talk about your product and how great it is to their think tank groups and their innovation groups and all those other organizations where that's how you scale your business. So stop automating your customer interactions. Stop forcing them to write tickets. You're too early for stuff like that. What are your thoughts on that?
I 1,000% agree. One of the things that we did at the company I just mentioned, Hightail, we made everybody in the company do what we called a fly along, which is where they would sit once a month. They'd sit on the phone for an hour with our customer support people. And that was eye-opening, for a lot of the engineers. And you identify these things where customers having an issue and the engineer's like, oh, I know how to fix that. And 10 minutes later, they upload a patch and the problem goes away, right? And so we really tried to, as much as possible, make our engineering team understand the customer needs, understand the customer pain points. I think that's really, really critical. And you're right, a lot of sometimes just the personality types of an engineer or technical person, they're maybe not as comfortable doing that. So we tried to create an environment where they could sort of see the problem without having to be the one sort of asking the questions or being on the front line themselves. Another company I was working on was early stage AI. The thesis was AI in the customer service center, right, in the call center. And as we delved into that space, I sort of had the exact realization you had, and I'm sure anybody who's ever experienced any kind of customer support can relate to, which is, you mean there's another way you're going to try to automate and not let me get to a human being? It just sort of felt like we were one of thousands and thousands of vendors trying to do the exact same thing, and at the end of the day, sort of irritate customers rather than help them. And the pivot that business went through is we said, hey, what if we delivered AI to the consumer rather than to the business? In other words, we said we could have an app where AI is used to help you get through all the customer support hurdles that you have to get through these days with your bank, your credit card, your airline, whatever it is. I think it was a really interesting concept. Unfortunately, COVID happened. So there are plenty of failures on my resume as well. So, we weren't able to raise money for that business. But I firmly believe that we're kind of approaching a reckoning on the customer service front where it's sort of like enough is enough. I mean, it's almost a cliche for Saturday Night Live of going through these IVR prompts and everything else that people have to go through and the hold music and the whole thing, right? That is a product that whole system was invented in the 80s and 90s and hasn't really changed that much. And I think that the businesses that succeed, going forward are really going to break the mold for how the customer experience is delivered. And I do think AI has the potential to be very helpful in that, right? I think the generative AI capabilities, the speech recognition and stuff like that, those technologies have improved dramatically. And I think that we as consumers have grown more comfortable dealing with automated solutions, but it can't be press one for this, press two for that. I didn't hear you, didn't understand you, right? I've thought about having a second career as a customer service exec, and I managed customer service in a lot of my roles, but frankly, I was sort of like one of those commercial people where I was managing customer service in addition to sales, in addition to marketing, right? And so oftentimes,
sounds familiar.
You're the glory and the attention is often drawn to new customer acquisition rather than customer retention. And for a company with an established business, there is one metric that matters. It is customer retention, right? And that's why smart companies really pay attention to that and look at what their customer recommendations and referrals and scores are, because if you don't have, not only if you're retaining, but ideally you're realizing growth out of that, right? In other words, those customers are referring you to other customers. You ultimately don't have a sustainable business, right? You can invest all you want in acquisition, and if it's just draining out the other side, it's just a matter of time before that business dies.
Mike, so my business, Hire Cloud, right? It's a technology consulting and recruiting firm. And one of the things that I've had like advisors or folks come in and they're surprised. They're like, you don't have a sales organization. I said, I know.
Yeah.
Like, where's your salespeople? I don't have any. And how the hell did you scale this business? And basically what the story was, I took such great care of early on in my career in our business of our clients, that they referred us to clients within their large organizations.
Yeah.
So then we built 7 clients within one company, and then those 7 people won't always stay there. So of those 7, 5 or 6 will eventually move on to 5 or 6 other companies. Then we'll do the same. So we 10x the business without ever having a sales organization. That's the biggest critique when I have, advisors come in and they're like, man, if we could just scale it, but you don't have a sales organization. I know we didn't have to. Now to get to the next point, that's a different topic, right? That's a different conversation I need to have, but people forget the value of customer service and really taking care of your folks, your clients.
100%. But you're right though. You touched on something right at the end there about organic growth. Sometimes we're not patient enough to let that organic growth happen, right? And so that's when we as people in this industry invest in, hey, how do we push that? How do we make it go faster? How do we make it grow faster? Because growth is ultimately the only thing that matters in this space. And so I think that's an important point too for any founder or CEO to really look at closely. You can invest in sales and marketing and do things that are going to grow the organization, but how are you converting those customers, right? How are you winning those new accounts or new users? And if it's sort of artificial, non-repeatable things, getting people to buy stuff they don't need or want, then that's a red flag, right? Because a lot of those customers will be gone in a year. If, however, your sales and marketing process really looks like, a validation process, right? Because, ideally, everybody you attract to the business and the product would get validation of their interest with a real customer, right? And so, you want to really make sure that you're sort of using the organic growth as the basis to drive accelerated growth and not doing artificial, unrepeatable, non-sustainable growth tactics that are going to flame out. Like that always flames out, right? It's like fast food. It might feel really good going down, and it's like, hey, we're growing, but pretty soon the writing comes on the wall, right? And I've been at businesses that as they mature, you can see that. You can just mathematically plot it, and you can see, hey, we're having this churn problem. We're the business is kind of tipping, and I think there's a lot of businesses that go into what I call that zombie business stage where they sort of are slowing down, and there's kind of this like they're kind of just treading water, right? And it's hard to kill a software company because you don't have a lot of expenses. If you can reduce your costs and reduce your employee head count, you can sustain a company for a really, really long time. But that doesn't always mean it's an interesting business. In fact, oftentimes it means it's a dying business. It's just dying sort of slowly. rather than in a ball of glory.
Mike, you said something earlier that was very interesting. You said, I have plenty of failures to talk about as well, which I think is highly valuable. I think mistake young people make, or they try to get advisors or successful people that have always just succeeded. I actually disagree with that. I like the fact that you've had quite a few failures, like I have, because what ends up happening is there's so much learning that happens in a real failure, so much humility, and so much access to all the things that can go wrong that people don't think about. The other day I was talking to a friend of mine, Art Simonian, really smart guy. He said, I don't know how we got into this topic. He said, I love doing business with folks that have gone bankrupt. I was like, what? I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, yeah, man, there's something about these people. As we started talking about this, it made perfect sense to me. I had just never heard it from that way. He said, look, if this person, once they've learned a ton, right, from failing at that level. Yeah. Two, they're still on their feet. So think about resilience. Yep. How much can I learn from their failures not to make the same mistake? That's invaluable. His angle was so interesting. I would have said something like, look, what am I going to learn from someone that's gone bankrupt? Obviously, they're not disciplined. Obviously, they made too many mistakes. They're the exact opposite of what I want to do. Yep. Well, guess what? One, you could just learn from that period. But if this person is resilient enough to have bounced back and succeeded again, oh my God, they are a great person to potentially do business with or hire or whatever, right? Get mentorship from. So sometimes I'll laugh because when I talk about all my businesses, one of the things I'll say is I'm also an investor in quite a few failed startups, and people are like, huh? You're not supposed to brag about that. I'm not bragging about that. That's literally the reality. 9 out of the 10 startups will fail, or 8 out of 10, and it's scary because those people are people, and I genuinely value them, but most likely they won't get to the next level. They'll either become a lifestyle business and barely survive, and others will just fold.
Couldn't agree more. I've learned more from the failures than the successes, if I'm being totally honest, right? I think when a company fails, if you're honest with it and you do a kind of a postmortem on it, you really can see things like, oh gosh, in hindsight being 2020, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish we'd done this. The successes, sometimes you can have the opposite. You can create this sort of almost fictional narrative, and you see this around the most hyper successful companies where books get written and there's sort of this almost revisionist history about how easy it was, or how and so I think being open and honest about failures is really important. I encourage that in people. I think you're right. The question I always ask if somebody's gone through a bankruptcy or their company didn't make it for whatever reason is a simple question. It's like, well, what did you learn from that? Right. And what I'm looking for is really, are they introspective? Are they, did they, take the learnings away from that? And very importantly, I don't ask it explicitly. Usually I'm waiting for them to say it. Why are you getting back on the horse, right? What is it that makes you want to go do this again when you've had a failure, you've had a company wind down, not return money to investors, et cetera? And that's really telling as well, right? You can get to grit and resilience, and those things are so important because for the successful ones, you still need those same traits that somebody might exhibit when they're digging their way out of an unsuccessful or failed company. So, I also would say, maybe this is my Silicon Valley bias, that I do think that this is a unique and really important aspect of the culture of Silicon Valley. Even though my book BitFlip, was a critique of that culture, one of the really unique elements is that we don't consider failure a failure of that person, right? Silicon Valley, by and large, many of the people have that point of view that you just described of like, hey, I want somebody who's, fell on their face a couple times, because that person's going to know how hard this is to do. They're not going to give up easily when the going gets rough. They're going to have that resilience, have that grit. And, I think in a lot of other sort of parts of the world, other industries, if you went out and you failed, you took investors' money and you drove it to zero, that wouldn't be regarded very highly. Here in Silicon Valley, there's second chances, and it's sort of recognized as like part of the process of cutting your teeth as an entrepreneur is to go through that. The other thing that I'd say is that the math that I described earlier in our interview about the venture capital business and their expectation that, out of 10 investments, 7 will go bankrupt and 1 or 2 might kind of puddle along, and then maybe 1 really hits big. I think a lot of entrepreneurs, especially early in their career, I was fortunate, as you mentioned, that I was one of the first startups I was involved with and did very well, had a very successful exit. But I carried a burden from that a little bit as well. Like my perspective was, oh, this should be easy. And when some of the other companies that I didn't have that breakout success, it was like, gosh, am I doing something wrong? Why is this so hard? And I think you almost as an entrepreneur need to take a portfolio view of your career, right? You need to recognize that, hey, if I have, 7, 8, 9, 10 jobs over the course of my career, and for many people, it's more than that. It's not unusual to change jobs every year, every 2 years. Many of them are going to be failures, right? Most of those companies are going to probably not be around or not grow at the way you expect. And if you're lucky, 1 out of the 10 companies you do will be really successful and your equity will be worth a lot of money. So, I think if you kind of come in with that mindset of like, hey, it's really hard to pick winners. If it was easy, everybody would do it. That's what you're doing with your employment. You're just looking to pick winners. You're not always going to pick right. And, when you do get one that looks like it has promise, hey, lean into that, put all your energy into that, really commit to it, see if you can get it to that promised land point, because, you're going to be lucky on the whole to have one of those in your career.
Looking forward into the future, where do you see the biggest opportunities for innovation in the tech sector, and how should aspiring tech leaders position themselves to take advantage of these trends? For now, it's all about AI, right?
It is all about AI. Yeah, I mean, and I don't really see this term anywhere. I'm sure somebody will chime in and tell me I'm wrong, that there's a whole school of thought around it. But I describe interesting businesses as applied AI. So there's a lot of generic AI tools, and they're interesting. And ChatGPT has captured everybody's imagination, and we sort of look at that and marvel at its potential. But a lot of what I see is tech without a purpose, right? It's tech looking for a business problem. And those I run away from. I would run away from, if I was going to be consider employment there, I'd run away from them as an investor. At best, you've got talented engineers who maybe get acqui-hired into another entity. But much more interesting to me is applied AI, where they're taking AI tools that may not even be their own tools. They might be open source or libraries that they're licensing or whatever it might be, but they know really, really clearly what is the business problem I'm trying to solve, what's the pain point of the users in that marketplace, why do existing software solutions in that sector not scratch the itch? And so I think those businesses are really interesting. I was looking at one the other day. I do videos on my YouTube channel that took place where a bunch of scenes in the first book happened. And I want to repurpose those to Instagram. So saw an interesting company that's what they're doing. They're taking AI to reformat sort of, YouTube videos to Instagram videos. And that's not rocket science by any stretch. But it's an interesting and very specific application of AI technology to take a task that would take you hours and hours of your time. It's not like you couldn't do it, but it would take you hours and hours of your time and make that much faster, much easier. So stuff like that, I think, is really interesting. And, the areas where, I invest very small amounts. I'm not an institutional investor, but I think those businesses are great. And if I were out of venture capital firms, that's what I'd be looking for.
Mike, you teased us with the first book you wrote, which sounds super cool. You got to tell me again what it is so I can go grab it right now.
Yeah, it's called BitFlip, BITFLIP. And for technical people, they'll sort of get that reference. So a bit obviously is binary. In binary code, it can be a 0 or a 1. When it changes, it's called a bit flip. And so the title of the book is meant to be sort of a metaphor for a change of heart, a change of direction. I always sort of like that title very, very early in the
right here.
BitFlip. Yes, thank you. And then over my shoulder, it looks like it's maybe in reverse. I'm not sure. But is my second novel, Burner. That also is a contemporary thriller. It takes place here in the Bay Area, just like BitFlip does. But it's not a sequel. Different premise, different characters. And it is sort of a political thriller, which is, hopefully particularly applicable as we go into the election season here. But it just, all my books really investigate the impact of technology on modern life, right? And so this one really delves into online, social networking, online, toxic internet subcultures, dark web, misinformation, disinformation, a lot of things that we've dealt with around politics and the collision of politics and technology. And that topic was really interesting to me and one I sort of crack open in this second book.
Tell us like a crazy story in the first book, I believe it is, about something you dealt with in a tech company or in a boardroom or something nuts to get us all excited about the book.
Something nuts. I think that there's a moment where in the story where this is increasingly, as time goes on, a dated vehicle, but the proof of this fraud is on a thumb drive. And Sam, the protagonist, has this moment where he can he's been talking with a reporter and he can blow the whistle on the whole thing, send the thumb drive to him, or he has a potential acquirer of his company. And if this problem goes away, he potentially becomes wealthy himself. And he flushes the thumb drive down the toilet, and so that's a real turning point in the book where it's like, Sam is succumbing to the dark side, has sort of lost his moral compass. And I think that's easy to do, and we see it all around. There is sometimes an incentive to push the business and fake it till you make it, and that can sometimes tip into fraudulent activities. And we've seen glaring examples of that with Theranos and FTX and other kind of infamous flameouts. And so I think it's a moment in the book where every entrepreneur should, read that and sort of say, hey, what would I do in that moment, right? Would I have the courage to sort of do the right thing, or would I sort of bury this? And I try to write the book in such a way that it's not 100% clear, right? There are a lot of shades of gray. Sam struggles with, hey, if I blow the whistle, we're shutting this whole business down. I'm firing 200 people, right? The doing the right thing isn't always a painless thing. It isn't always, and so I would point to that as a moment that a lot of people sort of resonate with, especially if they've had careers in the tech industry.
So do the right thing.
Do the right thing.
No matter what the problems that arise from it.
Don't be evil, right? Is famously the old Google. And I say old a little bit intentionally. I think they've sort of lost a little bit of, lost track of that original mission statement. And every tech company, there's a reason we call it big tech. It's very, very hard when you're a public company and you have the pressure to grow to resist those sort of tempting levers.
Mike, take us away with some brilliant advice on as an entrepreneur, as an individual trying to win. What should people be doing right now?
Simplest thing I tell people is enjoy the journey, right? I think in the tech sector, there's a lot of focus on outcomes. There's a lot of focus on successes, right? And those successes are hard to achieve. We all want them, but they can be really hard to reach. And if you aren't doing something in the meantime that you love, you might be disappointed in the end, right? And so I always say you got to pursue something that you enjoy the process. You enjoy coming to work every day. You love what you do, and regardless of the outcome, you will have enjoyed that ride. And so I think that's the best bit of advice that I'd give somebody earlier.
Great advice. Great advice, Mike. Enjoy the journey, right? Don't look forward to some $1 billion exit to make you happy, because the journey is where the happiness is in the present moment. Enjoy your team, enjoy the journey, the learning, I used to say, embrace the struggle to my team all the time when they were struggling, and they were looking at me like I'm crazy. What do you mean embrace, enjoy? What do you mean? It's like, yeah, dude, just stay in the moment and just say, ooh, this is tough. Ooh, it's going to be ugly. What can we do? And there's a weird energy that comes from embracing reality and the struggle and learning to cope with it.
Yep.
Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, man. Thank you so much for
Likewise. Great conversation, Avetis. Really enjoyed it.
And that brings us to the end of another great episode of the Tech Leaders Playbook. I want to thank you for joining us, and I hope you took away some valuable insights to apply in your professional journey. Don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform so you don't miss out on the next great conversation. I promise it'll be good. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate if you could leave us a review. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but it also helps others discover the podcast. Better leaders mean better working environments. Better working environments leads to happier people. Remember, a rising tide lifts all boats. I'm Avetis Antaplyan, and this has been the Tech Leaders Playbook. Keep leading, keep learning, keep giving, and I'll see you on the next one. Until then, stay inspired, my friends.